So I'm going to welcome Bucknell and welcome Dr. Kenley and turn the talk over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Can you see me okay?
We can see you great.
Good. I just want to move behind the podium a little bit so I can see the students who are here in Lewisburg. I'm happy that I could be here today. I was approached about a year ago by Dr. Jordan at the University of Pittsburgh, who asked if I would like to be part of this lecture series. My own research is on Chinese migration abroad and the way in which Chinese immigrants have influenced the societies, the host societies that they've entered. But this was supposed to be on Japan, and so I thought, let's look at the ways in which immigrants have influenced Japanese society. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there are all types of ethnic groups and linguistic groups and class differences that shape Japan today. So we're going to look at more than just immigration. We're going to look at the myth, what I call the myth of homogeneity in Japan.
Are you having some technical difficulties?
No, I feel great. Okay, so this is the image that we oftentimes think about when we think about Japan, is thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, a somewhat undifferentiated mass, where everybody looks the same, dresses relatively the same, and has the same values and the same group consciousness. But I'd like to argue for the rest of this evening that this is really a myth, that Japan is far from homogeneous. So if this myth is so popular, hey, Brenda, how about muting yourselves there? Is that possible?
I'm going to do it.
Good. So my question then becomes, who's responsible for perpetuating this myth of Japanese homogeneity? I don't know, I'd love to call on people at random. Maybe I'll call on the students that are here. Who do you think is responsible for perpetuating this myth of homogeneity? The United States. The answer is the United States is responsible for perpetuating this myth. And there is some truth to that. We see popular images such as the following. Asians, they all look the same. I actually saw this image, and you can't see this in Pittsburgh, sorry. I actually first saw this image in reference to the Chinese, and there was a series of questions next to this image that said, can you tell which one is mad? Can you tell which one is sleepy? Can you tell which one is stoned? Can you tell which two are twins? Now, those of you in Pittsburgh can't see this, but it's an image of about 12 school kids, and they all look exactly the same. And those in Elizabethtown can see this. Those here in Lewisburg can see this. Why do they look exactly the same?
Photoshop.
Because they are exactly the same. They've been photoshopped in. And yet when I show this picture to many Americans, including educated Americans, they just assume that, oh, they do. They just look all alike. Whereas if I showed you a photoshopped image of 12 American students and asked you why they looked all the same, you would immediately pick out that they were photoshopped. But our cultural biases don't allow us to see what is obvious right in front of our eyes. But it's not just Western media sources that are responsible for perpetuating this myth of homogeneity. The Japanese themselves, popular culture, government, educators, oftentimes perpetuate the myth of Japanese homogeneity. In 1941, the government released a text known as the Shinmin no Michi, which contained the very famous phrase that was used for the next several years, that Japan is 100 million hearts beating as one. Now, the reason for this type of propaganda was, this is the middle of the war, and we're trying to create a unified populace and trying to create people who think of themselves as being exactly the same as their fellow countrymen. But this phrase and this idea has continued long beyond World War II and has spawned a whole genre of Japanese literature and Japanese studies about the concept of Japanese homogeneity, that 100 million people are all the same. Our next question then is, why would we perpetuate these myths? Who benefits from such ideas? And I think I've already answered that to some degree. People who have a vested interest in maintaining loyalty, vested interest in clamping down on individualism, may see it beneficial to talk about homogeneous Japan. This is also a form of discipline, much the same way we would think of when we think of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, where we create power structures that keep people in line and discipline those who fall beyond the accepted parameters. Well, for the rest of today, and we have about 50 minutes to go, I want to take about 10 minutes to talk about each of these 4 groups that I suggest represent variety or that call into question this myth of homogeneity, that represent true differences in the case of Japan. The first of these is the Burakumin. The second are the Ainu. The third are the Koreans. And the fourth are non-Korean other immigrant workers, such as the Chinese, the Middle Easterners, the Brazilians. We're not going to have time to talk about all of these. We're going to talk in particular about the Brazilians because I find them such an interesting case study in Japanese society. So we'll start by talking about those 4, Burakumin, Ainu, Koreans, and immigrant workers. Let's start with the Burakumin. What exactly are the Burakumin? Well, in pre-Tokugawa times, there was relative social mobility. Different people from different classes could move up and down relatively easily. In 1603, with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, however, the shoguns decided it was in their best interest to create rigid class structures wherein people would not change occupations, would not change positions, and would have certain expectations relative to the law. And so we codified a social structure. And at the top of that social structure were the samurai. We're all familiar with the samurai. They represented maybe 6 to 7% of the total population. Beneath them were the peasants or farmers. They're the vast majority of the population, probably somewhere between 70 and 80%. Then there were the artisans, or those engaged in the industrial arts, the handicrafts, workers, neither samurai nor peasants, but artisan workers. And then at the bottom were merchants. Now, this 4-tiered social structure was informed by Confucian ideology. Confucius had long taught that peasants or farmers gave something to society. They were producing food and fed people. Artisans were providing important products, baskets, shoes, pots, things of that nature, whereas merchants really kind of just benefited from the work of others. And that's why merchants are at the bottom, because of this Confucian hierarchy. But there was one group that existed beyond even then. Well, let's stop here before I talk about them. Here's an image that kind of exemplifies what these 4 groups were supposed to look like. You've got in the upper right the samurai, the upper left is the peasant, the bottom right is the artisan, and the bottom left is the merchant. But beyond these 4 main occupations, there were others who were labeled as eta or hinin. Eta can be translated as the dirty ones, the many dirty ones. And hinin refer to the non-humans. This is almost like the outcasts in the case of India Hindu society. During the Tokugawa period, then, there really was very little movement and mobility among these four classes. And those on the very bottom, or on the outside of this class system, the Etta and the Hinin, were virtually locked into their position for life, as were their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, etc. They represent maybe 2.5% of the total population during the Tokugawa period. Who were these Etta or these Hinin? Well, the Etta were those who performed occupations or tasks considered defiling or dirty or impure. And here, again, this sounds very similar to the situation of the outcasts in India, and indeed there was probably some influence from this emphasis on purity. These would be butchers, morticians, leather merchants, people who dealt with dead bodies, dead animals, the byproducts, the waste from dead animals, dead bodies. This is an image then in the bottom right corner of a leather worker stretching out a leather to dry, a pelt to dry, and he would be considered as one of these, the members of the Etta. The Hinin, on the other hand, or the non-people, would be perhaps criminals, beggars, handicapped people, those who were seen as, for whatever reason, inhuman, non-human, beyond the realm of typical society. Both the Etta and the Hinin lived in their own enclaves, in part to protect themselves. They were outcasts in Japanese society, and therefore they did not enjoy all of the benefits, all of the legal protections that were afforded the other four castes, the other four classes. So they oftentimes would congregate into their own enclaves, either by choice or by necessity or by legal edict. And these villages or these hamlets were called buraku. And therefore, those who lived within the hamlets were the people of the buraku, or the burakumin. Any questions so far? You doing okay? Good. Let's talk a little bit then about the history of the burakumin. As I suggested, these really became strictly codified during the Tokugawa period, from about 1603 to 1868. And with the end of the Tokugawa period, Japan entered into a stage of rapid industrialization and modernization under the rubric, under the call of civilization and enlightenment. And many people saw the treatment of these burakumin as somehow uncivilized or unenlightened. In 1871, then, the government passed what came to be known as the Emancipation Edict, technically creating a level society, not just removing the special privileges of the samurai at the top, but also theoretically making all burakumin equal before the law. Not something you can simply legislate away, however. Attitudes are hard to change, and they persist for a long time. These buraku hamlets continue to exist well beyond 1861 for many of the same reasons that they originally were formed during the Tokugawa period. As recently as 1993, the government conducted a report wherein they found that 4,533 buraku, or hamlets, still existed, with a population of nearly 900,000 people living within those hamlets. Others suggest that that number is way, way low, that the buraku well into the late 20th century, the burakumin well into the late 20th century consisted of as many as 3 million Japanese citizens. Now, there are difficulties and challenges that these buraku face in negotiating modern Japanese society. Are we still good there in Pittsburgh?
Oh, we can't hear you.
Good, excellent, thank you. One of the problems that the buraku still face today is lower levels of education. This is in part because the schools built in or near these hamlets don't always receive the same level of financial support, are oftentimes avoided by the best and brightest students and the best and most talented teachers. So insufficient education or lower levels of education remain a continuing problem for the buraku even today. Another very interesting challenge they face is depressed real estate. Depressed real estate prices. If you live in what was previously a predominantly buraku neighborhood, chances are your house is not going to be worth as much as somebody who lives outside of that neighborhood. So we all realize that much of our wealth is tied up in real estate, and right off the bat, their wealth is significantly less than others. So why not just move out of the neighborhood? Easier said than done. First of all, you've got to find a buyer to buy your house within that buraku neighborhood, and then you've got to be able to afford to buy another house elsewhere. Even if you try to rent your apartment, if somebody knows that you're in a buraku hamlet, it's awfully difficult. It remains awfully difficult to find tenants. The buraku remain troubled with continuing public criticism. Newspaper reports, television reports oftentimes portray the buraku as problematic, troublemakers. It's popularly believed that the vast majority of the Yakuza, Japanese organized crime, that many of the Yakuza members are from buraku backgrounds. Buraku backgrounds and Korean backgrounds. We'll talk about Koreans here in just a minute. They suffer from job discrimination. It's not uncommon for somebody who comes from a buraku neighborhood to find it difficult to get a job, to be hired for a job. And employers oftentimes will do background checks to verify that the person they're interviewing is actually not from a buraku background. And finally, they face challenges in terms of marriage, marriageable partners. Even if you move out of the buraku hamlet, even if you find a job, even if you buy a house somewhere else, it's not altogether uncommon for future in-laws to do a little investigation themselves to find out who their future son-in-law or daughter-in-law will be. And if it's discovered that you come from a buraku heritage, you may find yourself in an unmarriageable condition. Ironically, Google has facilitated to a large degree the continuing discrimination against the buraku. About 10 years ago, Google began publishing old Tokugawa maps as part of their Google Maps platform program. So obviously many of these cities have been torn down and redeveloped, new buildings over and over and over again, and yet Japanese were able to, with a few mouse clicks, get onto Google and discover where the old buraku neighborhoods were, and using modern day technology would then continue some of the discriminatory assumptions into the 21st century. Well, what are the problems for the buraku today? They're still having some difficulties. The government has really gone out of its way to pass a series of laws designed to help and protect the buraku. As early as 1922, the government began passing laws designed to protect and avoid such discrimination. Those laws have been changed and altered and renewed up until 2002. And in 2002, the last real Burakumin protection law basically expired. The assumption is that discrimination against the Buraku is fading away and is not the same problem that it was years ago. The largest private Buraku group, the National Buraku Liberation Alliance, disbanded in 2004 because they themselves claimed the Buraku issue has basically been resolved. I think that's maybe too rosy of a portrait. I think there are still issues today, but fortunately, Buraku discrimination is certainly decreasing. Okay, any questions about the Buraku? Burakumin. I'm asking here in Bucknell. I can't see the rest of you, but if there's questions here, that probably means there's questions elsewhere. How many of you here had heard of the Burakumin before tonight? 2 hands are going up here. 3 hands are going up here in Bucknell, and it looks like one of them is a Japanese international student. 4 hands have gone up.
I have a question though. They are ethnically Japanese. You said possibly Korean, but
The question was, are they ethnically Japanese or are they Koreans? They're not Koreans. Are they ethnically Japanese? Well, that gets into a whole argument about how do you define ethnicity. Many Japanese would probably say, no, they're not ethnically Japanese. Most genetic scholars with DNA analysis would probably say that they share much in common with the Japanese. Good question. Well, let's talk about the Ainu then for a minute. The Ainu is another group in Japan that flies in the face of this myth of homogeneity. Who are the Ainu? Ainu is an ethnic group indigenous to Hokkaido, northern Honshu, the Kuril Islands, much of Sakhalin, and the southernmost third of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Basically the northern regions of what we think of today as Japan. The Ainu, I think it's safe to say they are not ethnically Japanese. They do have a distinct appearance, a different language, different religious practices. For most of their history, they have been a hunter-gathering society relying on hunting bear and fishing. They had limited interaction with the ethnic Japanese up until the Tokugawa period, up until the 17th and 18th century. As Japan settlers are moving further and further north, they're increasing their interactions with the Ainu. This was both good and bad. It brought opportunities and wealth to these previously isolated Ainu communities. It also brought diseases that they had not previously been exposed to. Smallpox in particular was devastating on the Ainu population, leading to large-scale deaths. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the Japanese government decided that they wanted to assimilate these Ainu into the dominant Japanese ethnic group. So in 1869, the Ainu language was banned, and the government put all kinds of restrictions and regulations on hunting within these areas, basically depriving the Ainu of their traditional economic practices. The Ainu were seen as uncivilized because they had no writing system. They weren't practicing civilization in terms of building large cities. And the Meiji rulers believed it was necessary to find a way to quickly assimilate and make these Ainu mainstream. If you think about it, it sounds an awful lot like what was going on with our own western frontier in the late 19th century, where many Native American children were taken from their homes, were put into boarding schools, were raised by Euro-American families with the idea that they could become assimilated into American society. Also, like we see in the United States, many of the cities and place names of northern Japan are of Ainu, are of the Ainu language. So they sound somewhat unique. In 1899, the government declared Ainu to be Japanese citizens, saying you are automatically citizens of the Empire of Japan. Now, this is good in that it provides them some international recognition, allows them to have a passport, what have you, but at the same time, it denied them of their minority status, suggesting that they no longer had the right to claim special privileges in defense of their language, in defense of their way of life, defense of some of their social structures. Well, the Ainu are somewhat discriminated against in Japanese society as well, particularly in the early 20th century. Today, many Japanese will suggest that you can distinguish the Ainu from the average Japanese citizen, that they look different. The Ainu are described as having, as being heavier or hairier, as having a broader face, as having more clear-cut facial features. The image on the left here then is the prototypical Ainu gentleman, where the person on the right is a prototypical Japanese. And then this would be a photograph of what an Ainu individual would look like today, and a photograph of a prototypical Japanese. Well, the Ainu have largely assimilated into Japanese society today. In fact, there is virtually no discrimination against the Ainu people today. Ironically, many Japanese refer to the classic Ainu look as being very appealing, very handsome, very attractive. If you tell somebody today that they have a clear-cut demeanor or facial features like an Ainu, they will take that as a compliment. On the other hand, some specialists say discrimination against the Ainus has not disappeared. It's that the Ainu people have disappeared. Indeed, you see Ainu museums, you see Ainu souvenir stores, but you rarely ever see Ainu people. As I was driving up here this afternoon, I drove by a store selling Indian paraphernalia. Do you know what I'm talking about? I thought, who works there? What's going on there? Right here in central Pennsylvania, you can go buy Indian rugs or what have you. It's much the same way in Japan. Tourists will go to these northernmost islands. They'll want to get in touch with the Ainu culture, but there is very few people who will be self-identified as Ainu today. It's estimated that there are perhaps 25,000 Ainu still in existence in Japan today. Some say that number is much higher, perhaps 200,000. Obviously, if we count the descendants and the offspring of these Ainu who have intermarried with other ethnic Japanese, that number would be much, much higher. It's estimated that there are fewer than 100 people today who still speak the Ainu language, making it, in effect, a distinct, an extinct language. Okay, any questions about the Ainu? Yes, here's a question.
Do you find that with the language becoming extinct that people are trying to put it together so it does not become extinct?
Her question is, as the Ainu language has become less and less spoken, has there been an increased value for that language and a desire to preserve it? And yes, in fact, in 2008, the Japanese government did declare the Ainu as a distinct minority group. After over 100 years of insisting they didn't exist, in 2008 they were recognized with many of the privileges that accrue as a result of that minority status.
And are there conclaves of Ainu?
Are there enclaves of Ainu today? Small
together
communities of Ainu? Yes.
And celebrate their traditions and culture and things like that.
There are, but most of those would be highly commercialized and probably suspect from the perspective of a lot of people. One more question, and then let's move on to the Koreans. Yes?
The language spoken, is that mostly by older people?
Yeah, right. Her question is the Ainu language that is spoken, is it spoken by younger people or by older people? And obviously, it's mostly older people, so we've got 100 speakers that we know of that still speak the language, and chances are they will be gone fairly soon.
In today's technology, they wouldn't record that.
Her question is have we recorded that or tried to preserve that language in some way? Yes. Yes, there are attempts to do so. Very good questions. How many of us had heard of the Ainu before today? A few more, about half. Good.
I also have another question.
One more question, yes.
The cultural stores, I guess, I'm just kind of interested, what would you buy since they were hunter-gatherers as a culture?
Her question is what do you buy at an Ainu cultural store? I don't know. I've never been to one. I would guess it has probably something to do with the hunting accoutrements and fishing paraphernalia that you would probably buy. Maybe dream catchers. I don't know. Yes, Mimi.
I just heard a student of mine just gave a presentation on Ainu last week, and she showed us this kind of very simple instrument that Ainu play with their mouth, and it's
Mimi's just explaining that one of her students just did
so
a
they would
report.
probably sell those at the store.
Just did a report on the Ainu, and she brought a mouth instrument, something I guess similar to a mouth harp,
Or like a
that maybe you could buy at one of these stores. I've got one. I'll sell you. Okay, let's talk about the Koreans. Are we still doing okay in Pittsburgh? Good, excellent. Let's talk about the Koreans for a moment. The Koreans are probably the most obvious ethnic group in Japan today. The most obvious clue that this myth of homogeneity is inaccurate. The Koreans in Japan are referred to as the Zainichi, which literally means those existing in Japan. And it has connotations meaning that they're here, but they're not going to stay here. Or they're here, but this isn't where they ultimately belong. The Zainichi refers to those who immigrated to Japan prior to 1945, the descendants of those people who have immigrated to Japan prior to 1945. It doesn't necessarily refer to those who may have moved to Japan in the last 10 or 20 years for educational opportunities or business opportunities. This is primarily referring to those who came at least 50, 60 years ago and or their descendants. Why are there so many Koreans in Japan? What is the history of the Zainichi Koreans? Well, I think we all remember that Korea was a colony of Japan. The Japanese asserted the dominant position in Korea after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 and officially annexed Korea as a colony in 1910. From that point on then, movement between Korea and Japan became rather easy to accomplish. As the Japanese and Korean economies became more and more linked together, more and more of Korean rice was being shipped to Japan to feed the Japanese population. For that reason, there were hunger issues in Korea. There were poverty issues in Korea. Many Koreans found it impossible to support themselves in their own local economies, and therefore they immigrated to Japan for work. Not all traveled simply voluntarily, however. As Japan's economy industrialized, there was a need for more and more laborers, oftentimes unskilled laborers. And to meet that demand, Japan turned to labor brokers in the case of Korea. They would go to Korea, they would arrange for Koreans to travel to Japan where they would work in a Japanese factory or mine or construction area for a certain period of time. Not indentured labor per se, but somewhat similar in that this passage is being arranged by labor brokers. Others were simply tricked into coming to Japan. They were misled by these labor brokers with false promises, inaccurate contracts, fraudulent contracts. And so while technically these Koreans are coming to Japan voluntarily, there is an element of coercion involved. And finally, some of these Koreans who came to Japan came as conscript laborers. During World War II, there simply was not enough people to work in Japanese munitions factories, those industries necessary to support the war. And so they simply went to Korea and said, you're in the army now and you're going to be stationed in Japan. Come back to Japan where we'll put you to work. After the war ended, most of these Koreans then returned to Korea, but several of them, a sizable minority, decided to remain in Japan. They remained in Japan in part because what's going on in Korea after World War II? The Korean War. They have very limited options. They can leave Japan and return to Korea, but they're returning to their own nation, which is deeply embroiled in war. So some chose to stay in Japan, at least temporarily, until they could have a more clear-cut path of return to Korea. It's estimated that over 2 million Koreans moved to Japan during this colonial period. But there are many challenges that the Koreans face in Japan throughout much of the 20th century and right up till today. One of the challenges they face is, again, lower education levels. There are various reasons for these lower education levels. One reason is, ironically, that the Koreans oftentimes build their own schools, their own Korean language schools. And initially, these schools were sponsored and supported by the North Korean government as a way of ensuring some level of loyalty among the Korean immigrants in Japan. But these schools were in the Korean language, teaching Korean history, teaching communist ideology very frequently. And therefore, when it was time for these Koreans to graduate and move on into Japanese companies and industries, they didn't have the language skills, they didn't have the writing skills, they didn't have the social studies skills necessary to be gainfully employed. The other problem is, as we see with many first and second generation families who try to maintain two languages, you end up with kids who are not terribly proficient in either one. Sometimes they are. Don't get me wrong. There are some who certainly can master two languages, but it's difficult. It's challenging. No doubt about it. These Koreans oftentimes face terrible public criticism. Again, they are accused of being the organizers behind the Yakuza, organized crime. They are oftentimes accused as being involved in petty crime, vandalism, graffiti, petty thievery. Whether this is accurate or not, these are the ways in which they're depicted in the media frequently. Not always, but frequently. This public criticism isn't going away either. As recently as last year, 2013, February of 2013, there were two major riots that broke out in Japan against or protesting against the presence of Koreans in Japanese society. One of those took place in Tokyo at the Korean town in Tokyo. The other one took place in Korean town near Osaka. And I have a video here that you in Pittsburgh can't see, and I don't even know if it's worth trying. Should we give it a try? All right, we'll give it a try. See if it works here. This is a scene of one of these anti-Korean protests through the streets of, I believe this one is Tokyo. Let's see if it works here. I'm curious to see if Elizabethtown can get this. We're really pushing the technological boundaries here.
Can you?
You get the idea. Some of these protesters were very angry, very vulgar, very.
They're not on the screen.
Where'd they go?
I think, go back, you may have chosen the wrong.
Were you in Internet Explorer or Google Chrome so that you were sharing the?
There you go.
Okay.
I think, which one do you use? The top or the bottom?
Can you hear us?
What happened, David? Yeah, David, what happened? We can hear you fine.
Good. Can you see me?
We can see you great.
Good.
Can Elizabethtown see you?
You've muted them, so we can't hear.
Elizabethtown, can you see David? Dr.
Yes.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes. Well,
No.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So we're okay? All three sites are okay?
Yeah, we're as good as we're going to get. I'm muting again.
Thank you, Brenda. I like you too. Okay, well, let's continue on with these protests. So some of these protests are quite nasty. Many protesters holding up flags that say things like, kick them out of the country. Koreans are roaches. Koreans are maggots. One sign said, destroy the whole Korean town. Make it flat and build a gas chamber.
Wow.
One teenage girl was shouting, just like the rape of Nanjing, we will execute the Koreans. Before it happens, go back to Korea. Now, this is a minority of voices in Japan. The vast majority of Japanese are not this angry towards the Koreans. In fact, in light of these two protests, there were counter-protests. And the video I just showed you was actually on one side of the street were the anti-Korean protesters, and on the other side of the street were the anti-Korean protesters who stood up and said, this has no place in modern Japanese society. But the fact that protests like these are happening does suggest that problems still exist for the Koreans. In addition to public criticism, we see job discrimination, much like we talked about with the Burakumin. We see marriage discrimination. It's not altogether unheard of for parents to hire private investigators to determine whether or not their future son and daughter-in-law is actually Korean. And for these reasons, many Zainichi have attempted to pass as Japanese. I use the term much the same way that we use it in our own U.S. history, where African Americans were tried to pass as white. This can happen by becoming a naturalized citizen. There are paths for the Koreans to become naturalized Japanese citizens by taking a Japanese name, by attending Japanese schools, and certainly many of these second and third generation Koreans no longer speak Korean, have no intellectual or cultural, have very few intellectual or cultural ties with Korea. And for that reason, it is fairly simple, if you want to pass as Japanese. A couple movies, in case you're curious. If you're looking for movies to share with your students, here's two that you might want to consider that talk about what life is like for Koreans in Japan today. The first is Go. It's about an angry young Korean teenage boy who attends one of these Korean schools, who's constantly getting in fights, who falls in love with a Japanese girlfriend. She doesn't realize he's Korean. He is able to pass during their period of courtship. They become very intimate, and in one of the most important scenes in the movie, you probably can't show this to your high school students, but one of the most important scenes of the movie is they're laying in bed and about to make love. He confesses to her that he's Korean, at which point she says, "I'm sorry, I cannot make love to a Korean." This was actually jointly produced by a Korean and a Japanese film studios, and it was filmed in both the Korean and the Japanese languages. And it continues on beyond that scene as he tries to reconcile what it means to be Korean, and as she tries to reconcile her own unrecognized racial stereotypes that she hadn't fully addressed in her own life. Another film you might want to look at, and this one is definitely usable at the high school level. It's called Linda, Linda, Linda. It's about a teenage rock band made up of 3 teenage girls, and they need a fourth to finish out the group, and they end up involving one of their Korean classmates. And it's a story of these 4 young women as they interact with each other and break down a lot of the stereotypes they have about each other, with the ultimate theme song being Linda, Linda, Linda. I would sing it for you, but we'll skip. Okay. Let's conclude with we got 10 minutes here to conclude with some immigrant workers. I appreciate your attentiveness. I hope you found this interesting. As we know, in the late 1980s, I think most of us here remember the 1980s. Not all of us, but most of us. In the 1980s, Japan's economy was really humming. It was growing at a very rapid pace, and there were labor shortages in the case of Japan. So Chinese workers, Middle Eastern workers, Korean workers began arriving in Japan to take up a lot of the jobs that the Japanese did not want to do. And in the face of this immigration that was, after all, obviously threatening the myth of homogeneity, the Japanese government passed in 1990 what came to be known as the Immigration and Refugee Control Act. The Immigration and Refugee Control Act. This allowed for limited immigration under very controlled circumstances to address the needs of what was known as the 3K jobs. Kitsui, Kitanai, and Kiken. Kitsui meaning difficult jobs, hard jobs. Kitanai meaning dirty jobs. And Kiken meaning dangerous jobs. In short, those jobs that educated Japanese didn't want to do. The same types of jobs that are oftentimes filled by illegal immigrants in the United States today. But this Immigration and Refugee Control Act also granted privileged immigration status for the so-called Nikkei gene, based on the grounds of jus sanguinis, or bloodline citizenship. Now, what does this mean? We have to take a little bit of a step back historically to understand what we're talking about here. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan's economy was industrializing, but there were many, many poor Japanese, many of whom decided to emigrate abroad. Has anyone been to Hawaii? Nobody been to Hawaii? Almost 1/4 of Hawaii's population today is Japanese, because there were Japanese immigrating to Hawaii to work in the sugarcane plantations. Many were immigrating to California, Southern California, to work on farms in Southern California. An awful lot were moving to South America, Peru and Brazil in particular. Peru and Brazil both have very large Japanese populations, or the descendants of these Japanese immigrants of 110 years ago. So Japan says, we have this labor shortage. We need to bring people back to do these difficult, dirty, and dangerous jobs, but we've got to maintain at least the appearance of homogeneity. So let's create a program where we invite these Japanese Brazilians, or Japanese Peruvians, or Japanese Filipinos. Let's invite them to come back to Japan. They will do these dirty jobs that nobody else wants to do, and then we can maintain the myth of homogeneity. They arrived, primarily Brazilians. Brazilians were the largest group that came. This image on the top left is of some of these Brazilian Japanese workers at the Mitsubishi plant. Here's a Brazilian Pride parade going on. I'm not sure which city this is in. But this is my favorite. And for those of you in Pittsburgh, I'm sorry you can't see this. This is a Carnival parade with scantily dressed, they look like, what you think of when you think of Carnival in Brazil, but they're actually ethnically Japanese parading down the streets. This immigration policy had mixed levels of success. For those who believed that you could simply take somebody who looks Japanese and bring them back into Japan and have them fit in seamlessly, they were obviously disappointed. Many of them brought their music, their dancing, their diets, their cultural practices. Many Japanese found it difficult to live next door to these Nikkei gene. And by the way, Nikkei gene means returning Japanese, those Japanese who are returning home. So culturally, it just never quite fit. It never quite worked. What's the other problem? What happened in 1990 with the Japanese economy? Are we afraid of Japan and their economic juggernaut today? Right. It was right about 1990 where Japan's economy took a nosedive. And for the last 24 years now, Japan has never been able to regain that same level of economic growth that they had experienced throughout much of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So now all of a sudden there isn't quite the same need for these immigration workers as there had been in the 1980s. The problem became especially critical in 2009. 2009, we had the Great Recession. We're still struggling to pull out of that Great Recession here in the United States. Japan, too, was especially hard hit by this Great Recession. So much so, in fact, that the Japanese government came up with a program. They went to these Nikkei gene, these Brazilian Japanese who had come to Japan 20 years earlier, and they said to them, we will give you 300,000 yen if you will please just go back to Brazil. Leave your job, leave your apartment, and please go back home. If you have a family, and many of them did, many of them had married local Japanese women and had children, teenage children that they had raised in Japan, many of whom knew no Portuguese and considered themselves Brazilian subjects. But the Japanese government said, take your kids with you. We'll give you 200,000 yen for each of your children if you'll pack them up and please just go back to Brazil. It's been very heart-wrenching for many of these families who had given up everything they had in Brazil to come to Japan with what they believed was a land of hope and promise, only to 20 years later be asked, please go home. We've decided we don't need you. I would hope that we could reconsider the myth of Japanese homogeneity, and I hope I haven't painted too dark a picture because the Japanese public has made tremendous strides. I don't mean to leave you with the impression that the Japanese are overwhelmingly racist, but there are people who want to perpetuate the myth of homogeneity. And when reality flies in the face of that myth, it leads to discomforting situations that demands responses that sometimes aren't always the most enlightened responses. It may be among the minority of the population. Those responses may be, and in fact are, decreasing over time, but the challenges and problems exist. I would suggest that we reconsider the myth altogether by recognizing the diversity within Japanese society, not only among the four groups that I've just mentioned, but gender diversity, religious diversity, class diversity. I think by embracing that kind of diversity, we can shatter the myth and hopefully undermine many of the darker sides of social structures that have come to light because of these myths. Well, thank you very much for sitting through an hour-long discussion. I've been taking questions as we go along, but I'm happy to take as much time as you would like to for the next few minutes to answer any more questions.
David, this is Brenda. David, can you hear me? And,
yes, I can, Brenda.
Okay, is it possible at all for you to swing the camera around so you can see the Bucknell group and you can also be in the picture? Is that an issue or can that be done?
She's checking up on our attendance.
Oh, I'm checking up on you guys. Hi.
We have 14 people here, including Dixie, who wants to say hi.
Hi, Brenda. From the
China. Well, see, I wanted to see all of you because I wanted our teachers here to see you, and I wanted the folks in Elizabethtown to see you. And I'll unmute Elizabethtown in just a minute. I wanted to follow up on something that David talked about. And David, maybe you wanted to say a few more comments on this, but back on the Koreans, the Koreans actually date back in Japan to the 7th century. And the more research that's done among art historians, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm an art historian. The more research is done on art historians, the more they're finding out that the 7th and 8th century, the early artisans who first created the statues that you see like at Horyuji and Kodaiji and other places, and Nara and Kyoto, were in fact either Korean or Korean descent. And they've traced that back by their names and the way their names are written and other things like that. So Koreans date back for centuries in Japan and in fact have been assimilated and yet not assimilated. And David, I mean, one thing I had as a question is how do these people who have been, they probably have Japanese names by now, and they live in places like enclaves in Osaka and so forth, but how are they regarded by today's Japanese? Are they Japanese?
That's a good question. I don't know if you can hear me or not. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you beautifully.
They are not technically considered Zainichi. That when we use the term Zainichi and the discrimination that's oftentimes projected towards the Zainichi is not, these pre-modern Koreans are not considered part of that group. Now, there is a lot of contention, as you probably know, among anthropologists who discuss how much Japanese culture is indebted to Korea versus how much Korean culture is indebted to Japan. And there's arguments going back and forth along those lines. But yeah, they're not technically considered Zainichi by most people today.
I think we also, before I let Elizabethtown have a chance, we had one question here from Pam, right?
Yes.
Hey, Pam.
Hey, you mentioned that the ethnic group up in Hokkaido, the Ainu, are they like Native Americans to America? Are they indigenous?
That's an interesting question, and I think that a lot of people have speculated that there are some DNA congruencies with Native American groups. They probably, if you subscribe to the notion, which most scientists do, that the Americas were populated by people coming across the Bering Strait, then if you want to go that far back, yeah, they're probably of common origin.
One more question. On those people, you mentioned social structures were different. How different? Do you know?
Yeah, many of the same terms we would use to describe hunting-gathering societies would apply to the Ainu. Much smaller bands, tribes, family organizations, not large city structures. There's no written language, so there's limited abilities to record histories or to record transactions. So yeah, when you think of hunting-gathering societies and the way they look, that's much the same way the Ainu looked prior to the Tokugawa period. I don't know much about gender relations, though. That would be interesting to find out what Ainu gender relations looked like.
Do we have any questions from Elizabethtown?
Wake up!
It doesn't seem so.
No pressure. Okay. Any questions back for David from Bucknell? I've got a comment, David. When we were in Japan in 2008, Erica, my daughter, had a friend who was, she did have a friend, one of her best friends was from Brazil. And they did go back in 2009. So I wonder if that was part of that situation. She also had another good friend who was from the Philippines. And they, it seemed like, the parents could not speak Japanese or read Japanese. And so there were a lot of times when I noticed, and they pretty much stayed in their own groups, their own church, their own social groups. But the kids were getting assimilated because they were going to Japanese school right along with my daughter. And they were becoming really, really fluent in Japanese. And they, I remember that they felt there was some discrimination. And yet sometimes that was a cultural thing. Like the kids got in trouble for going to the 7-Eleven after school in big numbers and hanging out and buying food. And they weren't disruptive. They weren't being bad. But, the 7-Eleven owner basically said, move along. And they went home and told their parents, and their parents got angry about it because they thought they were being kicked out because they were Filipino. Whereas my husband pointed out to me later that was probably a cultural misunderstanding, that in fact, none of these store owners in Japan want any kids in the stores after school. The kids are supposed to go straight home and study. They're not supposed to be hanging around the store picking up snacks or anything. They're supposed to leave. And so he thought that there was actually a cultural thing going on there, but it was interesting that the Filipino family, and they told me this too, that it made them very angry. They thought they were being picked on because they're Filipino. So that's just a comment about some of the assimilation issues that were at least occurring in Kobe when I was there.
The Brazilians were the single largest immigrant group, followed by the Filipinos, by Filipino Japanese. The biggest complaint that was oftentimes hurled at the Brazilians was that they were too loud. They played their salsa music on their boom boxes on the subway and down the street, and they simply were too culturally disruptive.
Yeah, that'd be a problem. Do you have a question?
Yeah, Dave, I have a question about, in the U.S. on the census forms every 10 years, right? That's always a running battle every 10 years about how you identify and what the categories are that sort of are given governmental sanction. Is there any sort of similar thing in terms of, which box do you tick? Can you tick I'm part Korean, part Japanese, or I'm, one of the returning Japanese, but my dad's Japanese. Is there anything state sanctioned in terms of a census?
I don't believe so. I think your options are to check your nationality based on what passport you hold. So the Zainichi, for example, if they become naturalized citizens, they will no longer be recorded on any official census as Koreans. They are then Japanese. Both countries have the policy that you cannot have dual citizenship. So it's either one or the other. Pick a side, and there's no going back.
David, I know that a lot of Chinese are coming into Japan for tourism. When you go to the onsen, you'll see whole busloads sometimes come in, as I've done, and you also, the largest group of foreign students coming in to study are from China. I was just told today by an ambassador, and I was wondering, how are the Chinese regarded in Japan right now?
Right now, is it this week?
as of these days, as opposed to, say, a century ago.
I think most Japanese welcome Chinese students. People who are coming to Japan to study temporarily, they see these as the best and the brightest, and they're welcome to partake of Japanese university systems. I don't think most Japanese think very fondly of the Chinese government and Chinese military right now, and that's a whole different discussion we can have for another lecture. But the conflict over these islands is becoming much, much more problematic, and inevitably, if the heads of state continue this line of engagement or disengagement, the Chinese citizens living in Japan are going to suffer, just as the Japanese citizens living in China are going to suffer. It's oftentimes the local people who receive the brunt of the treatment when there's antagonism between governments. I would say probably the Japanese in China are facing a rougher time of it right now than the Chinese are in Japan.
I was going to add, if Elizabethtown wants to ask a question, I do have you on mute right now. Just raise your hand. Somebody raise their hand if they have a question. I think I can see it well enough. Anybody? Still silent there. Okay.
Have you
raise your hand, Barry?
Have you eaten all the cookies in Elizabethtown?
He asked if we ate all the cookies. No, there's still some.
Put them back in my office. I want them tomorrow.
Okay, I'm going to mute Elizabethtown again. I wanted to tell everybody here that David was pointing out that you have these right-wing elements in Japan that will have these protests or do something that's very inflammatory, but in fact, I think in one of the protests you were talking about, a colleague just told me today that 20,000 Japanese showed up as an anti-protest to that protest to say that we are not discriminatory against the Koreans. And there's a huge number of people. And then she told me another incident that just happened recently where some kind of sporting event, I don't know if it was a soccer game or what, and a group of Japanese in the stadium put up a sign that says only Japanese can sit here. And and apparently the team didn't do anything about it or say anything about it. After the game, I think it was soccer league, not only told them, the team, that the next time they played, they had to play to an empty stadium. They banned those fans from the stadium permanently and did some other, things that were in some ways much harsher than what would have happened here in the United States. But it kind of showed that, on the official basis, or at least within the community, that was really, really disapproved of, that this small group did that. So what's interesting about Japan, I think, is that people have very different views. It's not like there's this homogenous view that they all think alike. There's some real diversity in opinion there too.
Unfortunately, it's oftentimes the minority who gets the attention.
Yeah, like here. Do we have any more questions from Bucknell?
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry. When people immigrate to Japan, do they live in particular cities, neighborhoods, what have you? For example, I mean, I grew up in New York City and everybody was an immigrant, but I mean, I live in Williamsport now and nobody's an immigrant. So are there particular areas that people go to?
Did everyone hear that? She asked, are there ethnic communities in big cities today? And the answer is yes.
Or more or less, like, are there certain cities that people go to over others? For example, I would venture to say that immigration in New York, San Diego, and what have you is larger than maybe Kansas City.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Same phenomenon. Immigrants are migrating primarily to economic opportunities in large cities rather than small rural communities.
Because interestingly enough, when I was in Japan in 2012, I had like a similar attitude. I just saw a lot of homogeneity. But when I went to Fukushima, everything changed. There were people there from all over the world working, and I wondered if that was an anomaly or that was because there was economic opportunity? Question mark.
Did you hear her observation?
Right, we can hear it.
Good. Yeah. The point that Fukushima had much greater ethnic diversity than she expected, and much more so than other cities in Japan. Yeah, interesting.
Another place that's like that is Kobe. If you go to Kobe, you see a tremendous diversity of people there. Bye.
We've got one more question here.
I was curious about citizenship in Japan. So citizenship is not automatically granted if you're born into the country. Even as an ethnic minority, you would still have to go through a naturalization process.
Her question is, what is the policy of becoming a naturalized citizen in Japan like? Being born in Japan is not sufficient to become a Chinese citizen or Japanese citizen. And there are basically two schools of thought for citizenship. One is that citizenship comes by place of birth, and the other is citizenship is bestowed based on bloodlines. And actually here in the United States, we have a little bit of both of those in our citizenship laws. If you're born in the United States, you're automatically a citizen. Or if you're born to an American citizen living overseas, you're automatically a citizen. There is a policy in which somebody who is not bloodline Japanese citizen can become a Japanese citizen, a naturalization process. But that's been a rather recent development. And it was fueled in large part by sumo wrestling. To be the top-ranked sumo wrestler in Japan, you have to be a Japanese citizen. And many of the best sumo wrestlers in the 1980s and 90s were actually Hawaiians and Samoans and Mongolians and people who were going to Japan to compete because there's good money to be made in sumo wrestling. And they were allowed to move up in their rankings, but they would inevitably hit a glass ceiling because they weren't technically Japanese citizens. And they said, we want to become Japanese citizens. How do we become Japanese citizens? And it forced the government to rethink the whole process of naturalization, whether Japanese citizenship is only available to those who have Japanese blood, whatever the heck that may mean, or if a Mongolian or a Hawaiian or a Samoan can go through a legal process to become Japanese. And that is possible now, but it hasn't been an easy process, and it's evolved very slowly over the last 2 or 3 decades with a lot of resistance among a lot of people. Fortunately, there's a lot of sumo wrestling fanatics in Japan that have helped push this process along.
And outside Japan, like me. David, another question is, for a while in, I think maybe the 1990s or so, there was quite a push in Japan for Japanese farmers to bring in women, particularly from Southeast Asia, to marry them because there was so much fleeing from the rural areas, and the rural towns are just dying, that often those women would go and marry a Japanese man and then, start over again. It's a good deal for her, it's a good deal for him, and very often they worked out. Has there been a change in that, or is that still happening, or do you know anything about the immigration of these women to rural areas?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, but I'm not sure I could say a whole lot more than what you've just said. I believe the offspring of those marriages are considered Japanese citizens.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Mimi has a question here.
With the low birth rate in Japan, do you foresee that means some economists say that Japan should have really opened their doors to immigration full scale, really in a much bigger way than they are. Do you foresee that happening as the elderly increase?
Yeah, I don't know if you were able to hear that question. Mimi pointed out very accurately that Japan's population is shrinking. It is it has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, and many people suggest that Japan's economic woes are in part a result of this declining birth rate. And one way to offset the problems of a declining birth rate would be more liberal immigration policy. The Japanese immigration policy has become more open and more liberal over the past 20 years, but it's still very closed relative to the rest of the world. And I think the Nikkei gene represent an excellent example of this. The realization that we do need laborers, but let's at least limit it to those who look like us or who have Japanese blood. So it's in some ways it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think Japan's going to have to do something, or it's going to become the primary geriatric society of the world.
Do we have any other questions from anybody here or Elizabethtown? Or yes, we have one in Bucknell.
We've got one more Bucknell, yeah.
I'm curious as to the ethnic homogeny versus the cultural homogeny. With globalization just increasing dramatically, are they as concerned about the cultural homogeny, especially the Western ways that are not looked upon as favorably?
Were you able to hear that question okay?
No, we couldn't hear that one.
Her question is, if there's this myth of homogeneity in Japan, is there any fear that Japan is becoming less Japanese and more Western? In other words, is there a similar backlash in the case of Japan as we see in places like France? Is that your question? Is there a pushback against Westernization in Japan? I don't know that I can answer that very authoritatively. I don't see as much pushback as you see in other places like France. Yeah. Does anyone else want to try to answer that?
Hey, David, do you want me to give it a try?
Sure.
The answer to that is historically, the Japanese had no problem bringing in Chinese influence or Western influence. They just saw that as a way toward innovation and creativity and progressiveness. And through the Meiji period in the early 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a lot of debate among the intellectuals and the people and the government on the kind of the balance between the traditional Japan and the innovative Japan. And there's all kinds of essays and newspaper articles and everything about, especially through the first 30 years of the 20th century, 40 years of the 20th century, people debating that back and forth and back and forth. But ultimately, I think today, if you go to Japan, the average young Japanese just doesn't really see any contradiction. They can be both in the same all at once, and I don't think it bothers them in the least. To be Japanese is to have a cell phone in your pocket and maybe be going to a sumo match, and then back to a baseball game, and then you go for takoyaki and eat it, and it's all part of being Japanese. It's a whole mix.
I was thinking too, this is not exactly the answer to your question, but if there's been some resistance to outside cultural influences in the case of Japan in the last few years, it's primarily been resistance to Korean cultural influence. Not necessarily American or Western cultural influence, but Korean cultural influence. And the resistance to that kind of cultural influence is waning over time. The Japanese are becoming much more accepting and big fans of Korean movie stars and pop singers and things of that nature. We have a Japanese student here in this room. Should we let her take a crack at that question?
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, I can see like Korean movement coming to Japan and other cultures too, but at the same time, so many people hate that, like, against those culture and trying to protest, like, against those culture and to protect our culture. So it's like back and forth.
I don't know if you can hear her, but she said that, yeah, the Japanese are open to outside cultural influences, but every time new cultural elements are introduced, there's inevitably people who push back against it and resent it and try to preserve what they see as the essence of Japanese culture. Is that correct?
Of course, remember everybody that we have some of that ourselves. Remember the huge controversy over the Coca-Cola commercial in the Super Bowl this year, where they were singing it in different languages? That's the Pepsi-Cola commercial, singing it in different languages, and it just, was it Coke? Okay, Coca-Cola. It just went viral on Twitter, apparently, with people arguing over whether or not that was American or un-American to sing America the Beautiful, wasn't it? In different languages. So I thought that was pretty disturbing and interesting at the same time. Yeah.
I think we're out.
Elizabethtown, one last chance. Any questions on Elizabethtown?
Actually, I have a question. You can't see me, but I do have a question. Yeah, it's just my hand. Are there still separate schooling for like Koreans or immigrants? Do they still determine education based on that or no?
Yes, there are still separate Korean schools. And for most of this period, it wasn't that the Koreans weren't allowed to go to Japanese schools. It was that they chose to go to Korean schools instead. And most of the Korean schools have been financed by the North Korean government. And although most Korean immigrants, most of the Zainichi in Japan originally hail from South Korea, many of them have left-leaning political views, and for that reason have self-identified as North Koreans by attending these North Korean-sponsored schools. These schools still exist, but because the North Korean government is increasingly financially strapped and unable to support them, they are dwindling, and people are recognizing that the education they provide are not up to standards, and second and third generation Koreans just don't see the need to identify with either North or South Korea anymore, and therefore are choosing to go to Japanese schools. So there are still these schools that exist, but they are fewer and fewer.
I know my friends went to like
The revolution will not be televised.
Okay, we have another question from Elizabethtown. Go.
The Japanese student right here said that in her experience, many of the Koreans will end up going to Korean Sunday schools to maintain some element of cultural tie.
Okay.
Okay, David, we have a question from Elizabethtown.
I know you said that you either have Japanese or Chinese citizenship. Can you have any kind of dual citizenship? Like, can you be American and Japanese in Japan?
No. For the same reason, neither Japan nor the United States recognizes dual citizenship.
But plenty of people in the United States have dual citizenship.
Yeah.
No, plenty of people in the United States claim to have dual citizenship, but the United States government, I don't believe, recognizes dual citizenship. The other country may recognize it. So if you're a Canadian, for example, the Canadian government may recognize both your Canadian and U.S. citizenship, but the United States government does not.
Because for the longest time, my mother had 2 passports, and she just had them rubber banded together, and depended which country we were going to. If we were coming into the United States, she would use that passport, and then she would use the other passport going into the other country.
Yeah, and I'm calling INS on your mother.
Oh, this is
I think that there may be some cases, I can't think of which they are, though, there might be some dual citizenship possibilities. You're right, it's the other country that recognizes it. But it is true with Japan. I've known Japanese Americans, they have to take a choice at age 19, I believe, but whether they're going to be Japanese citizens or American citizens. And I've had some students here at Pitt who have had to make that choice. Up until then, they can go back and forth as freely as they want to, but after that, they have to decide which passport they're going to hold.
I'm not an expert on citizenship legalities, but I believe that's the case. I believe it's it's always mutually decided upon by the 2 countries, but the United States, as far as I understand, expects you to have single citizenship.
So, any other questions, anybody? Well, David, thank you very, very much. It was a great Q&A, and we enjoyed your talk, and we enjoyed the PowerPoint that we couldn't see. And I hope your students down in Elizabethtown will finish up all their food. I hope the teachers and students of Bucknell had a good time. We certainly did here. So thank you very much, and we'll do this again next year, okay?
Thank you.